Hi everyone, my name is Megan, they them pronouns, and today we are going to be talking about how to make and use CustomKnight skins of your own creation. So briefly, CustomKnight, if you don't know, is a mod that lets you replace the default appearance of your player character, the knight, with anything you've designed or something else someone else has made. We're focusing on designing skins today. And it's made by a number of members of the community: JNGO102, Red Frog, Serena and Dandy. I think there's a few others involved. I do not know the full list. As a brief note, this is a guide for people who are already familiar with creating art and using digital art programs, so if you aren't familiar and confident with both of those, you may want to look at some other tutorials. In addition, you will need a number of different things for this tutorial. I'll go over them as they come up. The main thing to keep in mind is that it is best to use a Windows computer, not a tablet, not a phone, not Mac OS or Linux. Some of these things may work with tablets or phones or alternate operating systems, but a number of the big pieces will only work on Windows PCs. Finally, a few last notes for the intro. Number one of the things that you will need is an art program. I'll go into the art program that I choose to use, which is called Spritepacker, in a little bit, but I will note you might want to use a program called Krita, which is free as well. I note this because Italy, who's a fellow artist in the community, has created a script for it that will simplify some of the rather tedious things that we're going to be doing with layers later on in the video. And I'll link to that script that Italy made as well as his video in the description if you want to look at it. Number two is that you may want to skip forward in the video depending on what kind of sprite work you want to do. If you are doing anything that's really simple, where you're only changing a few colors or adding one tiny little thing to the sprite sheet and you just don't really care that much about how consistent it looks, there is a simpler method, and I will timestamp that in the description. However, if you want to change the line art or if you want to do anything beyond the simplest, I do recommend watching the whole video. Either way, it might be useful to watch some sections depending on what you're confident on. So I do go over how to use ModInstaller, how to do some of the effects that they do on the sprite sheet, etc. Just look at the timestamps in the description and see what you're interested in learning. Finally, thank you to Italy and SF Grenade, who are two friends of mine, for helping me to learn how to use these tools, and to Ink Scarlet, who created a tutorial for Spritepacker, one of the tools that we use, which I will be referencing in this video. So, to get started, the first thing that we want to do is we want to set up ModInstaller and CustomKnight. ModInstaller is what it sounds like. It helps you install mods for Hollow Knight. It was created by a community member named 56, and you can get it in the Hollow Knight Discord, which you can get to by going to discord.gg/hollowknight, or going to add a server, join a server, discord.gg/hollowknight. They all work. Now you specifically want to go to the modding help channel, which is right here. It's just a little bit down under in this Hollow Knight section, and you want to check the pins. And if you scroll down just a little bit, there are 3 messages pinned by 56. These are all ModInstaller. The first one is for Mac, the second one is for Linux, and the third one is for Windows. Like I said, there are some programs that work for all 3. I would suggest going with Windows if you are on a Windows computer, which is going to be the best situation for this. So I want you to download it. It's a really simple download. I haven't done it in a while, but I don't think there's anything complicated to it. And once you're done downloading it, you can go to ModInstaller 2, which I think it should just be called ModInstaller for you, but this is how it is for me. We'll pop up with this window. Don't worry about it, just don't close it because it will close the program. And you should get a window that looks something like this. Now you can either scroll down or you can type in CustomKnight. You want to first click this install button. You'll get a load bar at the bottom that will fill up, and once it's installed, it should automatically be enabled. If it's not, make sure it is enabled. The other thing that you're going to want, because CustomKnight relies on it, is mod common. Again, install and enabled it. There might be a few other things that it's relying on. I don't remember off the top of my head, but you can always ask in this modding help channel. I do believe those are the only two things that you need for this. I will say quickly, do make sure that you get ModInstaller 2. It will say it up here. There is another version of the ModInstaller that is older and it's pinned in modding discussion. It does not work anymore, so do not use it. That is ModInstaller, and it's pretty simple. The next thing that you want to do is you want to download the ever so important Spritepacker. Spritepacker is a really amazing program made by somebody whose name is MageG or Mage Guy, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And it can do several things that are going to be really important for us. The first thing it can do is the game by default holds its sprites in something that we call an atlas, or like a sprite sheet. And that's like hundreds of sprites, usually all crammed into one big image, which the game knows how to split apart. Our brains don't necessarily know how to split it apart, because the sprites for each animation are randomly spread across the sprite sheet. They're not in order. You can't tell which sprites belong to which animation. It's kind of awful. And so Spritepacker will split them apart for you. It will organize them by which animation they belong in, and then it will organize them by the order that they are in the animation. That's really important. Once you're done working with it, you can then take these individual sprites back together with the edits that you've done to them and pack them back together into another sprite sheet or an atlas, and then use that. The game can't read it unless it's in an atlas or a sprite sheet, so that's also important. And then the last thing that it does that's really helpful is that it gives you the ability to preview animations without opening the game. So you've drawn your animations, you've saved them, the Spritepacker will show you what that looks like. So in order to install Spritepacker, I have included a link in the description. It is a Google Drive. So your Google Drive should look like this. There are two folders, Spritepacker 132 and Sprites. I will note briefly, Spritepacker is very complicated. It is a little bit difficult to use. Kind of a headache, and it's a big reason why I've done less sprite creation than I wanted to. Another awesome person whose name is InkScarlet, I mentioned them in the beginning, created a very in-depth tutorial on how to use Spritepacker. And I will also have that linked in the description. I will do my best. I cannot guarantee that everything in my video will be completely sensical, will be 100% accurate, especially if Spritepacker changes over time. So I do suggest watching that video if you're at all confused. It goes into things in a lot more depth. But for now, I will do my best to explain things. So, we're downloading Spritepacker, but the first thing we actually want to do is we want to go into this Sprites folder. We want to click Sprites, then the Sprites folder inside of it, and download this Night folder. There's a bunch of other animations you can get. These are not really for the night. There's one with a spider cutscene, which is like Deep Nest. These animations aren't going to come up very much, and a lot of them aren't for the night at all. So for now, you can just download the Night folder. And this is going to have everything you want in it. So go back here, click download. I'm not going to wait for this whole thing to download, but I'm just showing you how it works. Once you have the Night folder downloaded, of course you want to unzip it. And after that, and this is very important, in order for Spritepacker to work, you have to put this Night folder in a specific spot. So what we want to do is you want to press your Windows key and your R key at the same time and go to %appdata%. And from here, you want to go back into appdating because it's going to immediately take you into roaming. Go into local low, go into Team Cherry, Hollow Knight, and we have this folder. You want to create a folder called Sprites. I think it has to be lowercase. I'm not 100% sure. It's probably fine. And you want to put your Night folder in here. So this is what it looks like. The same as it looks like in here. There's a bunch of folders that are all numbered. You want to stick it in there, and you want to leave it there, and you don't want to touch it. That's all. I recommend pinning this folder. You're going to be using it a lot because you're going to be pulling all of the images you're editing from this folder. So I have it pinned. If you want to pin it yourself, you can right click and put pin to quick access, and it should just be available very easily on this left hand side. That's that. The next thing that you want to do is you want to go all the way back to the Spritepacker folder and download this. Now, there's technically only 2 files you need to download in here. You need to download spritepacker.exe, and you need to download newtonsoft.json.dll. These 2 readmes are just instruction guides. I'm explaining things to you already, so it's not too important, but you can grab one if you want to. Now, Spritepacker and newtonsoft.json.dll can be put anywhere. However, you do want to make sure that these 2 are in the same folder. So I have a little bit of a bizarre organization system, but work with it. I have saved it under my S folder and Spritepacker. These are in the same folder, and they have to be, or else Spritepacker will not open. However, if you have your Knight folder in the correct location and you have Newtonsoft in the same folder directory as your Spritepacker, Spritepacker will open and it will work fine. And this is mostly what it should look like. You will not have this sprite here because this is an animation I am currently working on. So yours will look a little bit different. It should have the Knight. But the first thing you want to do is you want to set your language to the language that you're comfortable with. Spritepacker has 2 options. I believe this is Mandarin and there's English. I'm personally comfortable with English, so I choose that. And then with Go Dump, you want to pick 1.3, and that's it. Actually, I lied, there's one more thing. If you're working on files at all, if you're doing anything where you're saving your CustomKnight sprite, you want to click Watch. This will be unenabled if you close and open Spritepacker, and I encourage having it on at all times because otherwise you're going to have a lot of work down the line. And I'll explain how to fix that if you forget, but it'll save you a lot of work. So you can click Watch, and that should all be set up with Spritepacker. And that's all we're going to be doing with Spritepacker for now, because we're going to be moving to actually making the art. So we can close all of this, close all of that, and open up Fire Alpaca. I think I said this is the art program I prefer. It's free, it's open source, it's rather robust. You can probably use any art program you want. As I mentioned, Krita does have a specific script created for it by Italy. I do not personally know how to use it. So what you want to do here is you want to go File and Open. And this is the reason why I told you to pin this Knight folder, because you're going to be pulling all of your files from this. And I recommend starting out with the idle animation. It has the clearest view of the Knight, and it will help you really get your style down and figure out what you want to do. I'm not going to be opening up this myself because I have already animated over this, and this is not necessarily helpful. So instead I'm going to be going to 005 Run, which is an animation I have not finished yet. I have not started it. And you want to open up the first file in this folder, and there we go. Now I recommend, just for the sake of organization, renaming this to the name of the image in the file. So I believe this is 005. If I go back over here and check, 03032. The rest of the files will be automatically named what they are, but this first one we rename. And I recommend putting each frame in its own folder. This is going to help you with organization a lot too. You know, it's very easy to be like, yeah, organization doesn't matter. These files can get up to like 100+ layers, so it could really make the difference. And this next bit is tedious. You want to open as layer, open your new one, put it in a new folder. I do frame 2, close it, open as layer, etc. I'm only going to be doing 3 for you here today. It's not necessarily hugely important that I go over all of them, but this is the process you do, and you want to do it for every single image in this folder. And that's that. Now, I normally also start out by making a layer, that's below everything else, and filling it with a color that will contrast the main palette that I'm using in my artwork. You might not know your palette yet, that's fine, you can just do black probably. But you want to make sure it contrasts the colors. It doesn't need to contrast the line art, So like in this case, the line art's black. It doesn't matter that it doesn't contrast the line art. But this will help you recognize if you've accidentally missed coloring anything in. You'll be able to see like the holes in the transparency easier. Now I say that, I'm going to immediately turn it off because the first thing we're going to be doing is working on the line art. And obviously it does not contrast with the line art because the line art is also black. I set this image to a low transparency, around 15 to 25% usually, it doesn't matter too much. And then I will set up a new layer. And again, I'm very organized. I like to name them. With 100 plus layers on a file, this really does make a difference. And this is the point at which I suggest that you just mess around and try to figure out what you want your CustomKnight to look like. Now, in this case, this is not the best animation to do that on, which is why I recommend starting out with the idle animation, because the knight's in a little bit of a weird pose and you can't totally see what's going on. But let's pretend that for whatever reason, I want to use the running animation to figure out what I want to do with my knight. I slightly recommend, this is one of the reasons I say Spritepacker is probably easiest to use. This is the default pen brush, which I've renamed to my line art pen. And I keep it set at 5. The size is 5. This is a perfect, pretty much replication of the brush that Team Cherry uses. It's the same width, it looks the same, it feels the same, it's a-okay. The second one is also a pen brush. I've just duplicated the exact same pen brush and I've made it the size 10 because I use this to fill in color and I just don't feel like dragging the slider constantly. It's finicky. You can do that if you want to, it's not a big deal. But I recommend setting it to a low opacity, zooming in, maybe not that far, and tracing the bits that you want to keep. So let's say we want to keep the general head shape. You can trace that. But let's say that I want to do a different type of horn. I can then decide to do that. So you can mess around here and figure out what you want your knight to look like. And I recommend not going too far until you're pretty confident with what you want your knight to look like. Because this process, like the whole process of creating these sprites, is tedious. And it's going to be far more tedious if you decide halfway through that you really don't like your design and you have to go back and fix every single sprite. So I can and do often change my mind on a few smaller things midway into the process, maybe like a few animations into the process. But it's not recommended that you really start going hard on something that you're not 100% sure on. So we do this. The one tip I'll recommend briefly is that I really recommend finding these points of reference and using these to keep your art consistent. So the knight has a few points of reference. When I'm drawing the outfit, I like to use a split in the cloak as a point of reference. It's sort of the midpoint of the knight's body. And you're probably going to want to draw a cloak, a split in the outfit because that's really what the animation is designed for. You can also use the horns as a reference. So there's like a taller point on the outside and a smaller point on the inside for both of their horns. And you can use the outside line especially if you plan on doing something that is either a horn or horn-like. You can use the eyes as a reference. You can either draw the same sort of big eyes, or if you want to draw an eye, you can be like, well, I'm going to start doing these sort of sleepy eyes, but I'll keep them lined up with the bottom of the knight's eyes. These are all good points of reference to have that are really going to help you keep your art consistent. So you can draw and you can plan and figure out, this is what I want to do, and you do it all. The other thing I recommend is, as far as I've heard from computer people, layers can be heavy on your computer. They can take up a lot of power and a lot of RAM, whatever the term is. If you have the power to do so, if your computer is capable of it, I still do recommend using as many layers as possible. What I typically do is I do a line art for the head, I do a line art for the cloak and the nail, and let's pretend we're keeping these both the same. And if you want to keep the body the same, you can either do just another layer. I think I said line art earlier. You can do another layer for the entire body, or you can do a layer for the line art of the body. Up to you. But I recommend at least those 3 layers. And then I recommend a layer for each basic color element that you want. So let's say we're keeping everything the same except for the horns, just for the sake of simplicity. I can do one layer for the head. So let's say for some reason I want the knight's head to be yellow. I can go in here and fill it in. This is why I use a bigger brush to fill it in, because otherwise it would take ages. And that's that. And then I can do another layer below that for the cloak. Just pick a gray, purple color. And that can be our cloak layer. The reason I say this is because the more layers you have, the more control you have over what you're doing. So if I decide later on that I really like this head color, but I don't like the color of the cloak, if I had them all in one layer, it would take a lot longer. But because I have them on a separate layer, I can click Protect Alpha, which keeps it so I can only draw within what I've already drawn. And I can easily just scribble over this and do that. Alternatively, maybe I want to add a bow. And I go in here and I pick pink for the bow. This is like the shittiest skin in the world, but you know. I can draw it over here. But see, like, I want it to be under the head line art, but I want it to be over the cloak. And the thing I can do here is I can move this cloak into the right place. And now it's under the headline art, but it's over the cloak. So that looks proper. And that's the use of layers. For the skin I'm currently working on, which is somewhat more complex, you can see it in here. I have like 9 layers per frame, per this one frame. So I have the head line art, which includes the mouth and the eyes. I have the skin layer, which is all of the skin. The line art for this little cloak, the line art for, you can't see it very well, the skirt, etc. And that helps me have a lot more fine control, especially if I mess something up or I change my mind. So you've done all of this, and hopefully it doesn't look as bad as this. The next thing that you want to do, for the most part, you can probably hide this reference now. At this point, it's not going to be that helpful anymore. It's mostly for the line art. And then you can probably hide this whole folder if you want to. You can go back in here, you change it back to a low, transparency level, and then you do your process again. Now, how you're going to want to approach this is going to depend on the animation. In some cases, not in this case, but in some cases, Team Cherry took a part of the body and they copied and pasted it and maybe moved it around. So I think this is the case in like the walking animation. The head pretty much stays at the exact same angle the whole time, and the rest of it, like the cloak moves a little bit, but everything else is the same. If you're sure that one piece or more than one piece of the animation is the same from frame to frame and they've just copied and pasted it, I not only recommend that you also copy and paste it, because like it's going to be better for your sanity and your time, it's also going to look a lot better, because otherwise your animation is going to look very shaky and sort of like just kind of hard to look at. It's going to look very amateur. In this case, it's a little bit hard to tell, especially since it's kind of difficult to easily see both of these sprites at once. I'll show it to you in Spritepacker real quick. This is the run animation. These two sprites are technically different. The horn changes position a little bit. They didn't copy and paste, they have redrawn this. It's kind of subtle, but it's been redrawn, I think. Let's pretend that they didn't redraw it, that they did copy and paste this, because it's pretty similar enough that we can almost pretend that they did. You can take this and you can copy and paste this layer. Edit, copy, and then you can paste it. And you can move it to where they've moved it, and you keep it that way. And that's really simple. It saves a lot of time, and it keeps the sprite looking professional. Now, in this case, they did redraw it, in which case, you also just want to redraw it. Use your points of reference that you came up with earlier, and just do your best. And that's all. There's some differences where if you get consistency wrong, it's going to look really distracting, and there's some cases where it's not. And oftentimes you get them mixed up where you're like, this isn't going to be a problem at all, and then you look at it in the game and it looks terrible. And there's some cases where you think it's going to be a huge problem, and you look at it in the game and it's going to be totally fine, which is another reason why Spritepacker is useful. And we'll go into that more later because it allows you to chuck these things easier. But honestly, just do your best. Try to come up with frames of reference. The other thing is sometimes things are going to be pretty similar, but you're like Team Cherry has kept something the same for the whole thing, but you want to change it. You say, well, this head is technically the same, but for me, I want to make them look slightly to the right in this frame, even though Team Cherry didn't. And in these cases, what I recommend is A, you can use your previous drawing as a reference instead of their drawing. And B, one of the other things you can do is you can take the exact copy and paste that you've done, duplicate it, make the layer below it slightly transparent, and then take the layer above, erase what you want to change. I don't know why you'd want to change the horns, but let's pretend that you do. And then you can very easily sort of see how to change it. So I'm changing these ever so slightly. I'm kind of making them shorter. Maybe he's having a growth spurt issue, or whatever the opposite of that is. And that's easy. That's one way to do things, to make slight changes. I did this a lot with my skin, where if I go into here, the heads were basically the same, but I wanted to move these little tendrils just a little bit. So that's that. It's not as complicated as it looks. When you're coloring, this is when this comes in use. So you can see here that I had 2 holes. I'm not sure why it's looking like this. You can see I had 2 holes in the yellow, and that would help me catch those and fill it in. So I can go here, get my yellow color, and fill those in. And that's what that layer is for. And you can hide it when you're only doing line art, because it's really not that important. Alright, so you want to do this, and you want to do this with all of the frames on your sheet. I do recommend occasionally saving, and we'll get into that later. But you really only need to save once you're done with an animation. So all of the frames in an animation. And once you are happy with everything, you can do a little bit more setting up. One thing I'll briefly cover is this palette, which can be really useful. I don't think Spritepacker comes with it by default, but you can go to Window and click Palette, and then you can move it around wherever you want it to. I have it below my colors. And you can pick what colors you want to use. So I can select this. I'm using a hotkey for that, but it's pretty easy. And then go in here and click New, and I can name it like Head. And then I just press OK, and it's here. And when I hover over it, it will tell me the name. I'm not going to save that because I don't need it. But this is the palette I'm using for my current skin, and that's one tip you can use. I suggest doing that after you're confident with the palette you want to use. But you can really, it's easy enough to change. Now that you have all of that, you've got everything set up, I'm going to skip forward and pretend that you've finished the animation. And I'm going to say you want to save it all. I recommend saving your animations twice. I recommend saving it once in the native file format of your art program, or anything that will preserve the layers. So you would go into here. Spritepack's native file format is MDP. I'm going to also save it as a PSD because that would save my layers. And I could just go into my art folder and save this as a PNG or a PSD, and then I have it so that if I need to go back and change anything, I have access to the layers. The second thing that you want to do is you want to save it as a PNG. Now if you're using Spritepacker, you do want to make sure, A, that you go through export as opposed to save as. Save as will let you save things as a PNG, but I've found it's very finicky and doesn't work very well. And export is going to have this option where it's going to by default be on PNG 24-bit PNG. This will take away your transparency, so you do want to make sure it's that transparent PNG. And then you can save this. Now, I forgot to mention this, you want to save it and overwrite the current images that you have. So this is right here, this is my first frame. This is 0050032. I want to click on that and I want to overwrite it and replace it. In this case, I'm not going to because I need to overwrite this and replace it with the actual art for my skin. But if this was the art that you wanted to do, I recommend overwriting it because otherwise Spritepacker will not recognize it. It draws directly from this folder. Of course, you obviously also want to hide all of the stuff you don't want when you're saving it, so you wouldn't want to have the transparent night in the background. But those are the two saves that you're going to be doing for the most part. You can also save additional PNGs or, formats that use layers elsewhere if you want to, but that is how that works. Briefly, I am also going to go over the effects that Team Cherry uses. There are a number of effects that they use on the sprite sheet, and if you don't know how to replicate these, they can be difficult. So I will go over some of the techniques I use to at least get close to replicating these. So if I go over to the atlas or the sprite sheet for the night, there will be a few examples I can show off. You will see they have blurred the eyes here. There's a blur here. It's mostly blurs, basically. There's a lot of blurring that they do. These fit into two broad categories. They're either going to be motion blurs or Gaussian blurs. Motion blurs are these ones that make it look like the night is moving. So you get these with the C dash animation. You also get them with the regular dash animation and some other movement ones like here and here. Then there's Gaussian blurs, which are mostly used for void spell animations. So we have some here, we have some here, and you can just generally tell, does it look like the night is moving, or does it look like it's just a general blur? Now, I will show off how this works and how I do this with the CustomKnight I have been recently working on. So if I go to open, I have a dash animation. Actually, I want to go to here. I've saved an unblurred version. So if I go down to one of the frames, this frame would normally have a motion blur on it. For motion blurs, it's kind of different depending on what animation it is and what your personal preferences are. But what you want to do is you want to select each layer from the animation or the frame that you're doing. You want to go to filter and motion blur. In Spritepacker, I found that for the motion blurs for the dash, an intensity of 3 is perfect. You can also select preview. I'm only blurring these little lines up here right now, so it's a little hard to see, but that's what it looks like. And this compass will let you change the direction of the blur, which is going to be useful for some cases. But this is sort of a horizontal blur, and I usually do 3 for the dash. And you have to do this for every layer. That's Gaussian blur, whoops, and it's super intense. So you want to do a motion blur, 3. Motion blur, 3. I'm not going to do this with every layer, you get the idea. But you will have to do it with every layer if you're trying to do this correctly. At least for the frames where there is a motion blur. There are some animations where only some of the frames have motion blurs. For example, this is, like I said, is a dash animation. And the first frame and all of the frames past 7 do not have motion blurs on them. So you do want to keep an eye out to see which ones have motion blurs and just apply them manually. But once you're done with those, I will recommend that you save an unblurred version as well. I would save these as whatever format can accept layers. So this would be an MDP for me, and you'll note I have unblurred and I have blurred. I save these separately because it's really basically impossible to undo blurs, at least once you've saved them and closed the file and reopened it. But there will be cases in which you have messed something up and want to go back, and it'll be very difficult to try to fix that if it's blurred. I had to do this myself already, and I've only done 3 animations, but I realized I missed a number of things on these sprites, so I had to go back to my unblurred version, fix them, and then re-blur it. You'll also notice that it's blurred 3. I do that so I can remember in the future that I'm using an intensity of 3 when I blur it. That's just one trick I use to keep track of things, because this is a long process and you're going to forget things. So that's motion blurring. You also have Gaussian blurring. I do not have any sprites I can show you that would traditionally have Gaussian blurring on them by Team Cherry, but I'll show you what it looks like. So I would go into, again, have to do this layer by layer. I go into filter and Gaussian blur. and you can choose the value here, which will tell you how much it's going to be blurred. Really high level, and it becomes basically invisible. You can also preview it. I do not remember off the top of my head what the level of blurring is that most of these void sprites and others use, but you can play around with it. You'll also notice that some of these have little lines in the background. In these cases, I make another layer underneath my sprite, I draw vertical lines, I make it semi-transparent, and then I Gaussian blur them, or I motion blur them. I don't remember which one. You can play around with it and see how it works, but there's a number of these tricks. You'll also notice that some of these sprites have eye glow. You'll notice that some of these sprites have lanterns that glow. This is the last effect that I'm going to be teaching you, and it's kind of just figuring it out. What I would do, and I'll show you with my currently finished sprite sheet, because my newest one does not have these sprites done, is I would draw a circle freehand, because honestly it's not very noticeable and all that. I would fill it in with white, and then I would create a layer over it that's semi-transparent. Take an airbrush, I believe I did size 30 airbrush, sort of brush over it loosely. Again, this is semi-transparent, and that's it. And that would create a small glow effect. You can't see the glow effect very well here, actually. I'll show it to you. It's glowing. That's a lantern. I do a pretty similar thing with the eyes. I would take an airbrush over it, and I would sort of gently brush out where the effect was, and occasionally blur it. I don't think I usually blurred it. It's usually fine on its own. There are some cases where I think a motion blur, you might want to use it. Like there's some cases where the night is dashing down and the light goes up. You can honestly just draw those lines yourself. It's not a huge issue. But that's how you do those. I don't have any tips for the dream nail. I literally just traced it out in white. That dream nail is so complicated that I don't think you should bother with it, honestly. So the cases where they just decrease the saturation, and you can do that on your own. But those are some of the effects. Just mess around until you figure them out. They're not as hard as they look. Alright, you finished your sprites now, you've done an animation, and you want to see what it looks like and maybe test it out in Hollow Knight. So we are going to go back to Spritepacker. I will briefly explain some of this now. So you're going to notice these 3 columns on the left. There's animations, clips, and frames. I've never had anything in animations besides night. You might, but you probably should just ignore them and just click night. And then you can click the animation that you've been working on. So, you know, I'm done with this dash animation. And from here, if you want to view individual frames and see what's going on, you can click them and it'll stop the animation. You can also use your arrow keys to scroll through them. This one has a bunch of repeats at the end. That's the dash animation. And that's how you look at things. I want you to notice these 2 bottom columns. I don't really have any understanding of how generated atlases work. Don't worry about it too much. It's not a huge deal. I've never had to click on it. This is the original atlas that your thing is referencing. So this giant sprite sheet called night.png is going to have most of the stuff that you want. You might have to use Slug or Dreamgate. Dreamgate includes the Sprint Master animations and the Shape of Un animations, and Slug includes the Dreamgate animations on this, as well as Dash Master. And this one includes Shape of Un. But that will come up a bit later. So what you want to do probably is you want to pack your sprites. And what that means is it's going to take all of these individual sprites and put them on the big atlas so that the game will read them. And in order to do that, you want to click the animation that you want. You want to click the atlas. In most cases, it's going to be night. And you want to click check. Now, if you've had your watch on the whole time, it's going to come up quickly. It's going to say good to go. And from there, you can click pack. There's going to be a loading bar that will load. And once it's done, you will have it all packed. It will be back on the atlas, and you'll be A-OK. You may come up with an error message. It's going to be a little bit hard for me to replicate now, so I'm not going to bother. But the error message generally reads something along the lines of repeated sprites below in this collection, blah, 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 blah. And it's going to list some of the names of these frames. So like 203, 05, 498. And I'll just list them. And it's a real scary looking error message. It means that you messed up something with the watching, and you will need to fix it manually. So this bit's a bit tedious, but it will fix your problem. Is you want to click each frame that you in the animation that you're trying to pack and it's not working, and you want to click replace. Replace. It's saying check before replace. I can't because it's going to pack it, and I can't, like, because it's working fine, I don't even have the check option. But you would click replace every time, and once you've done replace for all of these, and it'll come up with a message saying it's worked, you can then pack it, or sorry, you can then check it and then pack it. Never had this have issues after I've done this process, so it should work a-okay. Like I said, tedious, but it will fix your solution. Now that you've packed, either way that you've packed, you should be able to access your completed atlas. So if you go into Night, Atlases, it's going to make a new sprite sheet called Gen Night, or Gen whatever sprite sheet it is. And if you click on it, you should be able to preview it and see that your sprites are now in the atlas. So if I zoom in, there we go. In order to get this in the game, and it's not very complicated, you want to click copy, you want to go over to Steam, manage, and browse local files. This is your other Hollow Knight directory. You go into Hollow Knight data from here, managed, and mods. I have a ton of stuff in my mods folder. You're going to have CustomKnight. If you go into CustomKnight, it'll probably be empty unless you've done stuff there already. What you want to do is you want to create a new folder. That is the name of the sprite or the animation that you're making, you know, the name of your CustomKnight, and you want to go into it. And then you want to copy and paste it into here. So in this case, I already have the sprite sheet. I can paste it again. I will delete this one, and then I can rename this to night.png. I'm not sure if Gen Night works. I know for sure that night.png works, and the game will recognize it. That's all. From there, you should be able to open up Hollow Knight and wait for it to load. It's going to take a little second, especially with all of the mods I have. You get a loading bar. And then we can start game and either pick a save that you already have open or start a new one. And you load in, and you can press escape, click the name of your thing on the left, and preview your skin in the game. Of course, it's only going to show the ones that you've already done. The rest will be the regular night. So see, if I walk, it's the night, but if I stay still, it's my little skin. If I jump, it's my skin. And that's that. Note that depending on the animation that you're trying to test, it might be a little bit difficult to test your animation. There are two mods I recommend for this. Number one is bench warp mod. This is how you get to places easily. So let's say that I want to test sitting at a bench. No, I've already tested that. Let's say that I want to test getting a spell. I can warp to Ancestral Mound. Now, you may or may not already have the spell on your save file. This is what debug mod is good for. If you have debug mod installed, you can press F1 and you can get this menu, and then you can take skills off of yourself. I don't want skills, so I'm trying to remove all of them. I probably might have to reset this room in order for the Snail Shaman to recognize that I don't have this spell. I'm not sure if it actually works this way. No, he doesn't want to give it to me. But you can talk to him and test out the spell without having to play the whole game through. And that's how that works. I'm not going to go over how to install them. It's pretty simple. You can just use ModInstaller, and there are tutorials out for how to use them as well. But those are the two mods I recommend. Debug mod will let you give and take away skills and stuff. Also give you some cheats if you want those. And bench warp will allow you to go places to easily test some of your animations. So that's that. I will note briefly, Your skin may look different in some areas. There is post-processing in this game, so it's going to change the brightness and such in a few areas. And yeah. Alright. Now, I mentioned at the beginning there's a simpler method, that I'm using a more complicated method with Spritepacker. I'll briefly go over the simple method. It really is quite simple. And it's the way that I made this skin. So what you want to do is you can get this file in the same Spritepacker Google Doc that I have linked in the description. And if you grab it, you can go into your Knight folder, into Atlases, and open the default Knight Atlas. For some reason it's already open. And this is the sheet. There's also a few other sheets that you want to use that you will need. It's mostly Dreamgate unless you really want to make slug animations. But this is the majority of things. What you can do is you can set this to a low transparency, make a new layer over it, and then you can just draw on top of all of them manually. This isn't ideal, and your animation will end up looking quite choppy because it's very hard to get good consistency. The frames from each animation are all spread out. They're in no particular order. It's hard to tell what belongs to what animation, but this is one way you can do it, and it's one way that I've done it. I recommend using the same tips, which is to say, like, maybe think about setting up a layer in the background that will provide a good contrast from whatever you're doing, and you can turn that on when you're drawing colors, and using a lot of layers if you can. And that's it. And once you're done with that, you can press save, and you can put it into your CustomKnight folder, which I mentioned earlier, and then you can open the game and select it and choose it. You can also technically use Spritepacker just to preview these animations. So I think if you just went to the Knight PNG, and if you replace the actual Knight Atlas in your Atlases folder with whatever you're working on, it should allow you to preview the animations. So that's one way you can do it, even if you don't necessarily want to do it animation by animation. And that's all. That's a simpler method. Alright, to wrap things up, I'm going to answer a few common problems that I've had in case other people have these issues. The first thing is that you finish an animation, you're really happy with it, and you save it, and then there's a colored block behind it, either in Spritepacker or in Hollow Knight. This can mean a few things. The obvious thing to do is you do want to make sure that this colored layer at the back, if you have one, is turned off when you save it. I make this mistake a lot because I just forget. Make sure to hide it and then save it again. The second thing you want to do, if you're using FireAlpaca and you're using the export method, is make sure that you're saving as a transparent PNG and not a 24-bit PNG. Last thing, regardless of what art program you are using, save it as a PNG. Do not save it as a JPEG. I don't know about other file formats, but definitely not a JPEG. Alright. The second area you can get is that your night looks really dull or really bright or like faded, and you're not sure why. There is a game feature that will allow you to set the brightness. It can really blow out your colors, or it can make you look really like gray. I just recommend 100. That's what it's at by default, but I made this mistake on accident and I thought my game was fucked up. Finally, if you think that you finished all your sprite, but you go in and you load it in, and sometimes it changes back to the night and you're like, what's going on? This can also be related to a few things. As I mentioned, you need more than the night PNG. If you're doing the Spritepacker method, I believe this includes pretty much everything you need. There are a few animations that I don't think Spritepacker includes that you may or may not want to spend effort doing. So if I go back here and I go back to Spritepacker and sprites, there's a few things that you might have that are going to look funny if you don't fix them. So the hatchling, you might want to edit it to look like whatever sprite you're working on. There are, of course, a few other things. Shadow Dash Collect. There are special sprites for this. It's not loading in, but you get the idea. Fluke Spell. I don't know if that actually includes the night, fireball, dream effects. These just look like regular effects. But if you want to, you can look through these. There's a number of things. The spider cutscene is one that's definitely, I mentioned Beast Den earlier. There's a lot of these animations in Beast Den. Personally, I don't bother doing these. They only really happen once in the game, and they're brief, and it doesn't matter. But if you want to make sure that everything matches and that your character looks like your character, make sure you get these set up too.